All right, I think we can begin. Um, I'm going to kind of back up to where we began with Solomon. I got a few extra things we'll throw in for free today. We remember David bequeathed to Solomon a pretty good sized kingdom, one that had stretched from the Euphrates to the north to the Brook of Egypt in the south, at least to the Gulf of Aqaba at the northern tip of the Red Sea. He had subdued the people David had on all sides, the Amalekites and Edomites to the south, the Moabites to the east, the Ammonites to the east, and the Arameans to the northeast, later to become the Syrians. And the Phoenicians were in partnership with David economically. They became important partners in several levels with David. The Philistines were pretty much left alone. They were a non-factor for most of, after David once defeated them, for the rest of the time until the very end. They tried to rise up again, but David made short work of them. And we said the Egyptians and the Mesopotamian powers were really in decline at that time. So they were the superpowers for most of history, and the Hittites as well, who branched off and got into the Syrian desert and just east of Phoenicia, the Hittites reached down. So David had Hittites to deal with as well. And so Solomon inherited the kingdom at its most geographically expansive point that Israel ever achieved. He was, set up quite well. The end of the book of 1 Samuel, the first or 2 Samuel, and the first chapter of 1 Kings actually it gets into the second chapter a little bit as David's final instructions as he passes the torch to Solomon. Now, as I said last week, Solomon's magnificence was heralded in its own day and subsequently became fabled. Solomon figures a large in non-biblical literature as well. He is prominent in the rabbinical literature, in particular the Midrashim. There are stories of Solomon that we have never heard before, are in Jewish literature and in Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalah has several stories about Solomon. The Quran talks about Solomon at some length. And even Arabian Nights. Solomon has bottled up a genie at one point. But in some of this literature, he performs all kinds of miracles and things like that. He becomes quite a figure. I said last week also that he was a master builder. We'll talk a little bit about that, the like of whom was not seen again until Herod the Great in the land. He glorified Jerusalem. He erected massive structures throughout the land. Trade routes by land and sea enriched his treasury. The two major trade routes that David was already collecting fares from, Solomon enriched them even more. I don't know if he upped the fees or they became busier as trade picked up. But Solomon, that was probably his greatest source of income, were those two trade routes, the Way of the Sea and the King's Highway. They're, as I said the last time, they're centuries old camel caravan trade routes. And of course, Solomon introduced luxury items on a wide scale, massive scale. He brought Israel to the pinnacle of its glory as a nation, maybe not as a moral entity, but as a nation, as an international power, as an economic force, and perhaps most of all, in self-indulgence. Solomon basked in splendor unprecedented in his nation, but the costs were enormous, and his varied and vast sources of income could not keep pace with his expenditures, as we will find out. His administrative structure reverted back to almost what Saul had. David had gone from a 6-region structure to a 12-tribe structure, and that didn't work. Solomon backed up on that and set up an administrative structure that, again, emphasized tribal antagonisms as much as it was in Saul's day. His religious practices we'll talk about, and his views caused him to be remembered as the one who sacrificed at the high places. The high places are raised earthen mounds with flat tops that were throughout the land. It's a Canaanite feature, but was appropriated at some of the Jewish shrines as well. That it's not really a piece of architecture, it's just the way the land is built up. They didn't have bulldozers, but they built high places that were just several feet above the plain, but could be seen at a distance. And the Canaanites sacrificed these, and of course Solomon did as well. And not only that, he introduced a host of foreign gods into Jerusalem. At his death, external discord combined with a resurgence of the ancient enemies around and at a distance combined to bring down his kingdom and return his dominions to their former status as petty states. Solomon's claim to the throne was tenuous. There was no dynastic principle yet in Israel at the time. We remember that Saul's son Ishmael tried to succeed his father but was unsuccessful at that. Solomon was not the oldest of David's sons. He was well down the list. I think he would be, if we counted the one that was stillborn, he would have been 8th in the ones that we know by name. There, of the 6 sons born to David while he was reigning at Hebron, the first and third, Amnon and Absalom. Amnon was the oldest one, murdered by Absalom, and Absalom was dead, speared by Joab's men. They were already dead. We don't know what happened to the second son. That's lost to history. And the fate of all the others is not known. Solomon is the second son of David and Bathsheba. The first one, as we said, was stillborn. So Solomon ranked way down the list of successors to the throne. With the title to the throne clouded by lack of tradition and the absence of a crown prince, fratricidal struggle, to the very least, was in prospect as it came time for the reign of the aged David to end. And no one was more keenly aware of this than David himself. He could see what was coming. Now, as David grew older, and it has him, they paint a picture of him as a frail old man almost. Some of you remember the story that one of the first verses, I think, in 1 Kings is that David couldn't keep warm. And so they looked high and low for a young virgin to keep him warm at night, this Abishag. And it said David knew her not. And we all know what that means. Adonijah, the oldest living son that we know. We don't know what happened to the second son, but he prepared to inherit the throne, and just south of the city in Rogel, he pretty much set up court there. The picture in 2 Kings is a massive celebration with sacrifices and everything, and also coming over to his side are Joab, throws in with Adonijah, David's general, and Abiathar, David's high priest, throws in with Adonijah, and several other court officials of David have thrown in with Adonijah, probably thinking that was the thing to do, realizing that David was on his way out. But David, under the urging of Nathan and Bathsheba, and we're not sure who first got the idea. 2 Kings gives it first to Bathsheba, I think, and talks to Nathan about it, and Nathan talks to David about it. They decide to forestall a power struggle after David's death. And of course, Bathsheba is interested in what David had promised her earlier, that her son Solomon would reign in his stead. And so the solution to the problem was for David to name Solomon and have Solomon anointed as king while David still lived as a co-regent. And so the priest Zadok this time anoints Solomon to be king. So they're both on the throne. And by doing this, he certainly delayed the breakup of the kingdom that came eventually after Solomon, and for the moment prevented probably further fratricidal struggle between the royal princes. But upon David's death, Solomon, motivated a lot by his mother and by David's own instructions, prepared and succeeded in carrying out a purge. David, in some of his final instructions, says in not quite directly, but almost directly, these people need to be dealt with. Joab is first on his list because he killed Abner, he murdered Abner in a time of peace as retaliation for what happened to Joab's brother in a time of war. And it should not have happened. But Joab, he says, do not let his gray head go down to Sheol before his hair turns gray, I guess. I don't know. And also, one Shimei, if you don't remember him, he cursed David when David was on in exile from Absalom's rebellion in Mahanaim. Shimei was one person who cursed him, and David wants him taken care of. Abiathar, the priest, David also has little use for now, who was David's really the head of the Jerusalem cult at the time. So David gives instructions for this purge, and it happens kind of indirectly, like people are spared initially while David still lives. They see that Solomon is crowned king, and they realize that the thing with Adonijah is not going to work. Adonijah, of course, realizes it as well and pleads for mercy because he knows the way things are done. When a new king comes in town, you deal with the old administration, and usually it was by murder. And so they secure various agreements, but then they make dumb moves. Solomon agrees not to have Adonijah killed as long as he doesn't do evil. It doesn't betray him in any way. Well, Adonijah goes to see Bathsheba and tries to get her to plead his case before Solomon that he might have Abishag, the king's concubine, David's concubine, as his wife. Now that move is often the move that's seen when one is trying to usurp the one in power, and that earns him his execution. The priest Abiathar is not executed, he's banished. Shimei is told that he will live if he stays under this house arrest arrangement he has. But Shimei hears something that he can't resist and leaves, and he is executed. Joab grabs on the horns of the altar, which is a way of, that's supposed to be asylum when you grab onto the horns of the altar, and said, eventually he says, just let me die here. And Solomon has a hitman by the name of Benaiah who does these people, and he's the guy, well, he's their hitman, I guess I would call him for lack of a better term, and becomes the leader of Solomon's army after Joab is done in the absence of Abner, who's been murdered earlier, and now Joab is done in. So this massive purge takes place, and then he further consolidates his position by appointing friends to the administrative posts throughout the land, including religious positions. Zadok is named the new high priest, as well as in civic and military posts throughout the land. Said that Solomon, one of the Midrash says that Solomon was 15 when he assumed the throne. More accurately, he was about 20. So he's still a fairly young man. So this purge and goes on. Let's see. Of course, Joab is the last one to be done. And Joab had been loyal to David through everything. But he was often undermining David's will for certain situations. But still, he was ever loyal. And now he threw in with that, made the mistake of throwing in with Adonijah and lost his life. So he's established now in unquestioned power, and he sets out to solidify his kingdom and to exploit its resources. Now, there was some shrinkage in Israelite territory at the time. Some of it may have been deliberate on Solomon's part because it was just too spread out to administer, and it would be stronger if he didn't try and reach out so far geographically. As I said, when one time Solomon fortified a city 125 miles north of Damascus, and Damascus is north enough that it doesn't even make this map. And so he's got an expansive reach, and he's way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, on just the Brook of Egypt, so he's got a lot to watch over. One thing that happened was the Arameans, or Syrians, same people, different name, rose up and established a king at Damascus. That's the first defection from Solomon's dominions that David had secured. Solomon quickly moved to fortify that city called Tadmor Palmyra. Now that's the one that's way up north, 125 miles northeast of Damascus, up to the Euphrates practically. And Damascus, or Syrians, of course, reading 1st and 2nd Kings, that they harassed Israel until the exile, until they were overrun by the Syrians and the Babylonians. They continued to be a force to be reckoned with. Now, at the same time, the Edomites to the south, I don't know, you can see it on your map, you see the OM there, that stands for Edom, that's the tail end of Edom. They're all the way down to the Red Sea. The Amalekites are mixed in there as well. But the Edomites, backed by Egypt, revolted, and Solomon ended up losing almost all the territory south of the Dead Sea, with the exception of the valuable mines, the copper and iron mines at the Gulf of Aqaba. And Solomon quickly built massive fortifications, and Ezion-Geber there became a military outpost at the Gulf of Aqaba to secure those mines. But it sort of is an indication of how precarious was his hold on the area. It was not the end of Solomon's trouble with the Egyptians, of course. They seized Gezer, just west of Jerusalem, but just about over to the way of the sea there, you can see, and burned it to the ground. Solomon moved to marry an Egyptian princess, a political marriage there, and the dowry of that princess was the city of Gezer. They gave it back to him, and he moved to fortify it significantly. And archaeology has located and done excavations at just about all the important fortress cities of Solomon, and discovered these chariot cities and these stables for his horses. Solomon rebuilt and fortified Gezer, but the Egyptian campaign in Philistia, which is not on your map, but it says below, back left by the southern part of the way of the sea there, you see there's a league of 6 important Philistine cities, and the Egyptians are moving in there. And so that is a signal of their reemergence in the area, reestablishing their influence after a hiatus of almost 200 years that the Egyptians had been a non-factor. Last week I introduced you to Jeroboam. He was an engineer, one of Solomon's chief builders and designers, a valued figure in Solomon's service, but he was singled out by the religious leaders in the north as a possible candidate of someone to lead them in revolt. And this was found out, and he had to flee to Egypt and go into exile and live there. Found refuge and encouragement in the court of Egypt, and stayed there until the time was ripe. So the kingdom diminished in size, but with Solomon's fortifications in strategic places, it was watchfully secure and remained so throughout his life. You don't read a lot about military campaigns when you read about Solomon. Incidentally, Solomon, as the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings deals with Solomon, and about first 7 or 8 of 2nd Chronicles deals with Solomon. You don't get much information, but we get a few details that 2nd Kings doesn't have. But I'd say 2/3 of the count in 2nd Chronicles has to do with the building of the temple. That's Solomon's massive project there. So in spite of, or perhaps because of, the loss of land, Israelite holdings remained an empire of considerable size and strength, and of course potential wealth. As I said already, the fares exacted from the caravans along the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea proved especially lucrative for him. Add to that Solomon's establishment of a merchant marine. Now it says in 2nd Kings that Solomon built the ships, and that Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician king, supplied the mariners for it. They were really Phoenician ships. I'm sure the Phoenicians had a hand in building them, but Solomon is credited with building them, but it was probably more Phoenician engineering, designing, skilling, and probably a lot of the construction. But he established his fleet at Ezen-Geber, which is right at the Gulf of Aqaba, where the mines are, and plied the Red Sea all along the eastern coast of northern Africa. And it says in 1 Corinthians 10, you get an inventory of the sort of things that Solomon's ships brought back. His commercial interests spread. In addition to all these exotic woods and animals and stuff he brought back, he also trafficked in grain and oil and wine and copper and even armaments. Solomon became an arms dealer, which he procured and resold to other powers, the Hittites namely, and the Syrians. So they could use the guns that Solomon sold to them, they could use against him. Chariots, spears, shields, armaments. Solomon maintained a vast mobile army, as evidenced by his chariot cities, not only in Jerusalem, but in this system of cities and his massive stables. The expenses were monumental, but not just militarily. It was said that he made silver as common as stone in 1 Kings 10 in Jerusalem. And he especially had a passion for gold. His throne was ivory overlaid with gold. Interesting throne. It had moving parts to it. And some said it's maybe the first example of a mechanical device in history, his throne. It's an extremely impressive thing. There are hundreds and hundreds of shields of hammered gold just for display in Jerusalem, in his house and in the temple precincts. And he surrounded himself with gold whenever possible. According to the Hebrew Bible, the ancient kingdom of Israel gained its highest splendor and wealth during Solomon's reign of 40 years. roughly 970 to 931 BC. In a single year, according to 1 Kings 10, Solomon collected tribute amounting to 666 talents of gold. That equals 40,000 pounds of solid gold. He's described as surrounding himself with all the luxuries and grandeur of an Eastern monarchy, Oriental potentate, and his government prospered. He's in the alliance with Hiram of Tyre, who in many ways greatly assisted him in a lot of his undertakings, trade especially, and also construction. He had a harem. It's reported 700 concubines, there's 700 wives, and 300 concubines, though the only wife named is Naamah, an Ammonite, and mother of Rehoboam. And if my memory serves correctly, I think Rehoboam is the only offspring that's mentioned by name of Solomon. The wives are described as foreign princes, including Pharaoh's daughter, which was a political marriage entirely, and the women of Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and of the Hittites. The marriage to Pharaoh's daughter cemented that political alliance for a time with Egypt, but it says he clung to his other wives and concubines in love. Apparently he didn't love the Egyptian one much, but the women, combined with an army of servants and managers and priests and officers and other bureaucrats, swarmed about the royal palace, making it abundantly clear that Solomon's household was equal in Oriental splendor to any of its day. Like other potentates of the time, he dwelt in opulence at the expense of the people and laid the heavy hand of despotism on those who hailed him as king. Still, the focus of Solomon's glory is not on all his acquisitions, but on the house he built for the Lord. The dream denied his father David became the grand undertaking of his life. We get more details from 2 Chronicles. David had basically laid up all the materials for the temple that was to be built. He'd been collecting not just the construction materials, but also the vessels for worship and all this kind of thing. Had the plans drawn up already, and even had a contractual arrangement in waiting with another Hiram of Tyre, not the king, but a builder. The king Hiram of Tyre recommended this Hiram of Tyre to be his chief builder and architect and engineer in the job. In 1 Chronicles or 2 Chronicles, it's Huram instead of Hiram, but it's the same guys. David intended to replace the tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant with a permanent structure. It was a revolutionary idea with far-ranging implications. The portable sanctuary, the tabernacle, was indicative of their wandering status as a people, of the nomadic lifestyle, was now to be transformed into a national shrine, indicating permanence and a religious claim to the land. Nathan brought word to David from the Lord that a warrior who had shed blood in battle should not build the Lord's house. But Solomon, a man of peace, would fulfill his father's hopes. The project lasted 7 years, 7.5 actually. And upon its completion, Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." The dedication of the temple takes up the bulk of the account of Solomon in 2 Chronicles, including Solomon's prayer, which goes a whole chapter in Second Chronicles. But the temple didn't stand alone as Solomon's. It wasn't alone in Jerusalem, but it was part of a complex of royal buildings, not the least of which was Solomon's house, which took 13 years to build. Now, that's the writer of Second Kings. It's little more than a footnote in Second Chronicles. But the writer of First Kings makes a deal of this and gives the dimensions. And it's roughly 3 times the size of the temple. And certainly more elaborate and more expensive. Of course, the throne room was the centerpiece of the whole thing. But the city walls were expanded. David expanded them. Solomon expanded them more. So the ancient Jebusite capital is about tripled in size by the time Solomon is through. He built shrines and temples, as we have said, to honor the gods of his foreign wives in various places within the city precincts. And with these shrines and temples came these foreign religion priests. The writer of First Kings calls them abominations. That he names the religion the abomination of Ammon, the abomination of Moab. Jerusalem is a primary focus of Solomon's building, but adding to his glory were the fortifications built throughout the land. Now, these fortifications, you should also realize, were administrative posts and trading posts as well for Solomon's commercial interests. Well, the price of glory is always high, and in several ways, Solomon's was certainly no exception. He diluted the effectiveness of the temple as a national shrine and central focus by erecting all these pagan shrines, both in Jerusalem and throughout the country. And then, too, was Solomon's own participation in alien worship. We read about it in 1 Kings 3. Solomon himself, and that's very early in the account of Solomon's reign, was he already worshiping as a pagan. Now, in this first chapter of 1 Kings, where you get David's instructions in the passing of the mantle to Solomon, they're very specific about the if and then. If you are faithful, basically, is the bottom line. And if you are not, then the kingdom will be taken from you. Solomon is well warned, but his pagan worship proceeded anyway. Second Chronicles does not make a lot of this. There's a lot of, just like in the case of David, the chronicler cleans up Solomon's act too, to a large extent. It's mentioned, but almost only in passing, all of Solomon's worship and building temples and shrines to pagan deities. Solomon's economic policies proved even more disastrous. Money from the already mentioned sources, the trading routes, the maritime trading, and sales of goods that he imported, his import-export businesses, were never enough. Taxation became more efficient under his administrative redistricting, but also undoubtedly became heavier on the people. Add to that his imposition of forced labor on Israelites, not just foreign slaves. David got in trouble for conducting a census. Solomon did conduct a census of the Canaanite cities and so on that were within his reign, and first drew his slave services, as did David, from these pagan cities, pagan populations. But that wasn't enough for Solomon's building project. He conscripted Hebrews into his service as slaves. I'm They weren't lifetime slaves, I'm sure. But they did, it was like a draft. They served a period of time as indentured servants, as slaves. And that is the key impetus of the latter rebellion of the northern tribes under Jeroboam, was the fact that Solomon enslaved his own people. Rehoboam, when he became king, threatened to make it even worse. The leaders of the northern tribes appealed to Rehoboam to get rid of this idea, and he says, I'm going to make it worse. You think you got it bad now? Wait until I start rolling. So credit also became a huge problem for Solomon as well, as evidenced by he tries to pass off on Hiram of Tyre 20 cities as payment for debt, but they prove to be worthless. Hiram is insulted by them, but it kind of indicates that here is a kingdom that is approaching bankruptcy under Solomon. Even before Solomon's death, the price of glory was exacted upon Israel. And by the time he did die, the northern tribes were in a virtual state of defiance, outraged by Solomon's apostasy and by his forced labor policy, and with Rehoboam, the successor, threatening even worse to come, they called Jeroboam out of exile in Egypt to lead them in full secession. Soon the Egyptians were in the land, laying waste to Solomon's magnificent fortresses, sacking Jerusalem, temple, and the palace. That empire, faithful David and splendid Solomon, was reduced to 2 petty states in competition with a dozen others, and at the mercy of the now revived giants of Egypt and Mesopotamia, just almost immediately upon Solomon's death. A couple things that come up with Solomon often that I might mention. The wisdom of Solomon, and that is especially described heavily in the chronicler's version of the story, but also in 1 Kings as well. He is credited as being the author of several biblical books, although there's no place in the Bible that says that he authored them, including not just collections of Proverbs, and he collected thousands of Proverbs, 1 Kings reports. But he's also credited with Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, which is also called Song of Solomon, the great love poem, and later with the apocryphal book, The Wisdom of Solomon. And if you read the Quran and other editions, there's even more that Solomon is credited with. In brief, there's an unelaborated and enigmatic passage in the Hebrew Bible, both in Chronicles and Kings, about the fame of Solomon's wisdom and wealth spread to even the far-off regions of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba is described as visiting Solomon, bringing a trainload of gifts, including gold and spices and precious stones. And she wants to see and hear for herself about Solomon's wisdom. In 1 Kings, she gives him a sort of oral exam. And it says, he answered all her questions. And she was just blown away by this. And he also gave her anything her heart desired, he would give her as a gift. And then she went home. So, and that's also told at some length in 2 Chronicles, but not as much as in 1 Kings. Sheba is typically identified with as Saba, a nation once spanning the Red Sea on the coasts of what are now Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, and even Yemen and Arabia. Although other sources just say it's part of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. But that story is indicative of the reputation that Solomon is at least trying to project. Basically, his wisdom is about flawless. We all know this, the famous story of dividing the baby in half, the two prostitutes, and one of them, and that is in the text is something that signals the blow-away wisdom of this king. No one else would have thought of that, but he did. Let's see. I'm trying to think if I have anything else. We've got his construction process. Yeah, I think I've said everything that I have to say, so I'll open it for questions. Yeah, David.
It's a remarkable life in terms of what he accomplished. I'm trying to think of what's commendable about it, other than his financial success, the commercial successes, the way he built up the building of the temple, etc. But do you think there was ever in Solomon a relationship, with the God of Israel's history?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there was, yeah. But it wasn't wholehearted, I guess, I would say. But yeah, Solomon's, you hear this, the words of the elaborate prayer at the dedication of the temple are somewhat indicative of Solomon's own faith, I think.
Yeah, what makes me ask the question, I think, is wondering, are these things real? He builds the temple to fulfill his father's dream, and it's a great achievement in the eyes of the people. The prayer obviously is a wonderful prayer. Is it his? And how might that have played out beyond that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. The text, 1 Kings isn't really kind toward Solomon. It's rather judgmental. It builds him up to a certain level and then brings him down even lower than it built him up. Chronicles is kinder. There's virtually no mention of the foreign gods. As I said, over half of the story of Solomon in 2nd Chronicles has to do with the building of the temple. And a large part of the account in 1 Kings starts with the building of the temple, and then interrupts it with the building of the palace, and then finishes it with the dedication of the temple, moving the vessels of the worship in and the dedication of the temple, which is long and elaborate. Yeah. Harvey.
The Christian religion of Ethiopia gives a lot of emphasis on the relationship between Queen of Sheba and King Solomon.
Yeah.
And they emphasize a great deal that that relationship produced a son which became the early judge of the nation of Ethiopia.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that out. Yeah. That's right.
An observation and then two questions. The observation is that when visiting Egypt, I was impressed by the fact that the layout of the Egyptian temples is a template for those of Solomon's temple. The forecourt, the inner chamber, and then the Holy of Holies in the very center. So much for the observation. The questions: do any of the scholars that you considered give any idea as to the degree of hyperbole that goes into some of these figures that we read in 1 Kings and in Kings and in Chronicles?
Yeah, I don't know if they calculate, but there's general agreement, especially among archaeologists, that a lot of the descriptions are hyperbolic. You know, the numbers of the populations, the size of military forces. You look at, in Israel, some of the, Tel is a hill of ruins, it's Hebrew for a hill of ruins, where the city is. And the city could be maybe 3 or 4 acres. And yet the Bible will describe a population of 100,000 people or something like that. Something, you know, that's, and the thousands of chariots Solomon had. It just, you know, I think it is a little bit of a Near Eastern way of telling an epic story, is hyperbolic. And I think that carries even till today. I told Don last week about, at the end of the last week, I had a friend that I was in graduate school with, was a father of the Society of Jesus, Catholic priest, and he worked in Jerusalem for a couple of years, and he was there during the War of '67 and those years, and he was in the bazaar or in the marketplace and trading, talking, visiting and stuff like that, and a man came up to me and started telling him about what a great and glorious battle is going to take place tomorrow, you know, and he started to say how large and expansive this was, and sure enough, the next day, a helicopter flew over, there were some shots fired, and 5 or 6 people were killed. And then when Jean Laverdiere was his name, when he came by again, the man rushed out and, "See, didn't I tell you?" He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Oh, it was just a little skirmish." And the guy looked at Jean and said, "You don't understand nothing, do you?" Yeah. Kid.
Steve, I think I maybe missed this when you've probably mentioned before. Could you give us a timeline as far as years when all of the adventures of David and Solomon were taking place, about which you've spoken?
I talked a little bit about it. Solomon, we're pretty accurate on Solomon. It's roughly 970 BC to 931 BC. They have some corroborating information from other sources, non-biblical sources, contemporary with the times, that give it. And it just says that he reigned 40 years. And the same for David. He reigned 40 years, 7 at Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. I have a chart, but you know, actually I've got a couple of them, but they vary so widely. It is a guess for Saul. But we usually think of this time, this golden age of Israel, being the 10th century BC, by and large. Part of the 11th, you know. Oh, yeah.
Steve, is it fair to ask what was going on in the rest of the world? Do you know anything about what was happening in the Chinese area, for example? And were there any kinds of interactions between the biblical world and the Eastern world? We know about Egypt a little bit, but what about the rest of that?
I'm sure that can be found, what was going on at the same time. There are all kinds of timeline charts to tell you what was going on in various parts of the world. The influence of these people in what we consider the Palestine area, Phoenicia would take it the farthest because they had the maritime traffic going all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, as far as we can tell, and all along the northern coast of Africa and down the Red Sea. We don't know anything about Indian Ocean or anything like that. But people from this area. And of course the Hittites, their kingdom is much, much older. Not just the branch of Hittites that were in the Syrian desert and a little bit of north part of Palestine, alongside of just about as far south as Phoenicia. But they covered most of Turkey So there's the Black Sea as well. You know, they're Anatolian people from the Anatolian Heights, which is the bulk of Turkey. But I don't know, you know, China, India.
Yeah.
I could probably fairly easily tell you what was happening in these dates. But what interaction there may have been, I don't know.
At that time, the Tang dynasty in China was prospering and probably was more magnificent
Yeah.
than Solomon's, kingdom would have been.
Yeah.
I have a question about the building of the temple, because Solomon had to rely on a lot of artisans and craftsmen from the northern area, like Tyre, the Phoenicians, and such. So I wondered if there were many people in Israel themselves who were able craftsmen. Was it still a basically pastoral society, and they just wouldn't have the know-how to construct a big temple or palace like that?
Certainly, you know, because Israel is under the influence of all these surrounding peoples. But under David, they were primarily remained a pastoral and agricultural people. Already in David, though, the standard of living is climbing exponentially as a result of trade and sources of income. So they certainly would have developed into the trades themselves. And Israel, under Solomon, they became a mercantile society as well, because they had these trading posts that Solomon had established all over the world. So I think, you know, even all the way through the kingdom, I think most people are tied to the land. But the fact is they did have the means, they had growing means to be in other occupations and vocations as well. Yeah. And certainly that blossomed under Solomon considerably.
To totally change the subject, Steve, you talked about how I think you said that Saul kind of organized the nation into six regions. David went to 12 tribes, and Solomon tried to reorganize it under 6 regions. Can you describe a little bit more how they actually managed the country?
Saul's reason for taking the 12 tribes and reorganizing into 6 regions, 5 in the north, which became Israel, and then Judah to the south. Later, Judah and Benjamin threw in with the south after Solomon. And there was already some defection in the time of David on the part of Benjamin for the loyalties as to where they would exert themselves. But Saul did this probably to stifle the self-interest of the tribes, to turn them more into a nation, to make them work together more. And it was easier to administrate too. And David wanted to heal the breach. He'd exploited this difference between north and south, and then when he rose to power, he had to heal the breach that he'd so skillfully exploited all these times. So he went back to the 12 tribe system to break down this 2 alliance. The 5 northern regions had formed sort of an alliance that was known as All Israel. And the southern, the 6th district, 6th region to the south being Judah. He emphasized the 12 tribes to sort of break that down so there wouldn't be a strong alliance, division of these 2 alliances against him. As I said, it didn't work administratively at all. It worked in the temple. I mean, in the centralized worship that the synagogue moved into Jerusalem with David, the Ark of the Covenant, and then the high priest and all the Jerusalem cult beginning. The 12 tribal system, which had been since the time of Joshua, was religiously organized into 12 tribes. The shrine at Shechem, each tribe serviced it for a month. But it also, the trouble with that is the tribal leaders, there was a tribalism when you organize into 12 tribes. They had too much power, and tribal leaders, and for central government to control that was virtually impossible, as we've seen, as I said last week, in Afghanistan is a good example of that. It just didn't work. And then Solomon, I think, for business and tax reasons, and also the failure of the 12 tribal system in terms of administrating the country, he saw it didn't work and reorganized it into something that would work, that would, again, as Saul did, to break down these tribal self-interestness and competition between the tribes to make it a governable country. Yeah. Well, it's been a well-behaved group.
Well, unless there are other questions, I think it's 1:15, so I want to thank you very much, Steve, for a very thorough presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you.